Welcome to part 2 of my 3-part video series on how I built a cedar strip canoe in my garage. This is really the heart of the build, where you do the planking, where the actual canoe begins to come together, the sanding, which is a non-stop process throughout, and the fiberglassing, where I made my biggest mistake that I'll explain later. But this is really the heart of the build, and it's an exciting part because you really get to see a canoe being formed from your hard work. So let's talk about planking first. I arranged the planks by color in an attempt to have differentiated dark and light plank sections, but it did not make much of a difference with my canoe. The planks were all so similar in color that there were really no clear sections. I wish I had asked Noah's Marine about this and possibly received darker pieces or figured out a way to darken some of them, but it still came out beautiful. If you remember from the last video, it was key to have the molds perfectly level and square. To keep this shape, I lightly nailed a plank the length of the form so that it would hold when I started the planking. Next step was to attach the first plank. I was a little stressed about this, but it went really well. The book explains this perfectly, but this is not a straight level line. You attach the first plank in the middle and then let it naturally sag to both ends, and this gives the perfect curvature to the canoe. After the first plank was fastened, then a very repetitive process begins. You'll need a stapler, a lot of wood glue, something to insert the wood glue in the cove of the plank, and a partner to help with the glue dripping. I bought some art syringes from Hobby Lobby and used those to place the glue in the cove of the planks. I had quite a few of those because they get dried out. And the process is to place a bead of glue in the cove of the underlying plank, place a new plank in that cove, hold it down firmly and staple into place while placing pressure, and then clean up any excess drippings, and that's where it's good to have a partner. As each plank is secured, you saw off the piece that extrudes past the end of the canoe. It is a fun process because the canoe is taking shape and it's not too difficult. There will be some gaps. You will fill those in later with wood filler. The technical part begins when you reach the bottom of the canoe. As you can see, you work one side of the planks past the center line of the canoe and then carefully measure a center line and then cut those planks to a straight center. And then the tricky part begins. I had to cut to fit each plank perfectly. This was tricky and time consuming. Some of the planks I cut perfectly and they were totally flush with the other side. Some had gaps and there was nothing that could be done except apply wood filler at a later time. I did make a notable mistake here. There was one large gap on the bottom of the canoe, and without testing it somewhat first, I mixed epoxy with some sawdust that was not fine, and then I smeared it into that gap. It did not work well, and it set very quickly. You can still see it today if you look at the bottom of my canoe. I should have waited and practiced making epoxy with a finer sawdust, or I should have just used the commercial wood fillers that I used later on in other parts of the canoe. The next step was one of the most satisfying and also nerve-wracking because you only get one shot at it: cutting out the shape of the boat from the planks. I used an excess plank by attaching it in the middle of the canoe and then pulling it down to form the line I wanted, reaching out to the ends of the canoe. After the line was traced, I freehand cut the shape of the canoe with my skill saw. Although I was nervous, I think it came out really well. Once the shape was complete, I worked on making a smooth and tight hole. This was a lengthy process of first using a scroll to remove excess planking and ridges, very satisfying by the way, then sanding, filling gaps, and more sanding and filling gaps, hours and hours of sanding. I highly recommend you get a mask for this. I'm so glad I did. I used it throughout the build, and I think it really helped me safety-wise. And now for the fiberglass part of the project. I had never worked with fiberglass before, so this was quite an adventure. Some tips. First, have a team to help you. Second, you might want to practice a bit on some scrap wood. This is a process of someone making the epoxy by mixing hardener and resin, someone applying it, and someone scraping off the excess. My first batch of epoxy was made from the hardener and resin that came with the kit. I created my own pump system by purchasing 2 plastic pump containers online, and I attempted to get the right amount of hardener and resin to make epoxy each time, but that was a little rough. I then purchased West Systems hardener and resin with graduated pumps that will give you the exact right amount of hardener and resin to make epoxy each time. I wish I would have started that way. It went much better, and it took away some of my stress. You're going to need a large drop cloth, scrapers, brushes, we used foam, it worked just fine, a roller, plastic cups to make your resin in, although remember to make your batches small each time, don't make too much or there'll be a chemical reaction, and as I said, a team. You will then lay the actual fiberglass sheet over the canoe and then begin applying the epoxy you have just made by mixing resin and hardener. The outside of the canoe was much easier to work on, although this is where I made my biggest mistake I'll talk about in a minute. The inside is trickier because the fiberglass bunches up, but it's one of the many parts of the project you just have to roll up your sleeves and go for it. You can sand it out later. All right, let's talk about the 2 big mistakes I made. The first is that we did not scrape enough epoxy off in between coats. It looked so shiny and nice after I would finish each coat that I thought it was going well, and I should have scraped much more off. I paid for this later by having to sand many extra hours because the epoxy had hardened and it was too thick and it had runs in it you could only see when you started to sand. I should have scraped more off in between coats. Second, we did not mix our resin and hardener properly on 1/3 of the outside of the canoe. This stopped the project for almost a month. I could not figure out how to get that to harden. It was tacky. I thought I had ruined the project. I tried everything, including going out one night and trying to scrape it off, and I did some damage to the cedar planks. Finally, I got on a fiberglass workers message board and someone suggested putting talc on it. I bought an industrial sized bottle of Gold Bond foot powder with talc, and I went out and coated 1/3 of the canoe with it and left it overnight, and miracle of miracle, it worked. I came out the next day, the epoxy had dried, I was able to finish the sanding, it went great from there. So that's the story of part 2, putting on fiberglass, and join us for part 3 as we finish the project.